What if the Phoenicians discovered America? A lot of you are probably thinking that I'm insane for saying the Phoenicians could have crossed the Atlantic in 600 BC, but it's actually not as insane as it sounds. The Phoenicians were immensely good sailors. To the east they reached India, to the west they reached Britain, to the south they were able to circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa, all before the Wars of Alexander. Many of you are probably thinking the Phoenicians wouldn't have been able to brave the waters of the Atlantic, but a Greek explorer named Pythias was, according to some accounts, able to sail so far into the Atlantic he could have seen the mountains of Greenland before being turned back by a current. And so I think it is fairly possible. In the early 1900s, Thor Heyerdahl was able to sail a reed ship of Egyptian design from North Africa all the way to the Caribbean, and Phoenician ships were light years ahead of the Egyptian-style ships. So it is fairly possible, actually. There actually is a theory that the Phoenicians did reach America, and there is some slight evidence for this, but that's a story for a different time. For this timeline to start, there'd have to be contact between the Phoenicians and the Americas. Let's say a Phoenician galley gets blown off course and ends up off the coast of Brazil. It goes back to Phoenicia and tells Carthage or Gades about its discovery, and the Phoenicians send more ships out. The route looks something like this. The Phoenicians would leave Spain, go down the coast of Africa, across the Atlantic to Brazil, and then up the coast of South America into the Caribbean. Due to its strategic location, the Phoenicians probably would have settled somewhere on Cuba, and they would have started sending settlers over to the island of Cuba. Unlike the Mongols or the Romans or most other empires across history, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians didn't spread via conquest. They spread via trade routes and merchant alliances. Phoenician colonization happened something along the lines of this. The Phoenicians would create a trading settlement on the coast, and the native peoples would come to this trading settlement to trade with the Phoenicians. But over time, these trading settlements would become massive cities, and the native peoples would become trading allies with the Phoenicians, and because they would be linked by trade, they would create a NATO-style relationship, in which the Phoenicians and the native peoples would become military allies and help each other in wars. For example, most of Hannibal's army in the Punic Wars wasn't even ethnically Phoenician. Most of it came from the allied peoples of North Africa and Spain. A similar sort of thing would have happened in the Americas, where the Phoenicians spreading out from Cuba would have created trading settlements around the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, and over time these would develop into vast, bustling trade centers, and a Phoenician empire would be built around the rim of the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. The only major resistance to the Phoenician trade pact would have been the Mayans, who were the only major powerful civilization at that time period in the Americas, and thus the only one who would have had the population numbers and sophisticated long-distance supply networks to counter the Phoenicians. This likely would have led to a conflict between the Phoenicians and the Mayans, and the Phoenicians, with control over the sea, likely would have launched an attack on the Yucatan. It would probably be a very close-run war. On one hand, the Mayans are disunited and have a slight technological disadvantage because the Phoenicians have Iron Age technology. But, on the other hand, the Mayans would be more numerous, and they would be fighting on their own home turf, where guerrilla tactics would be highly useful. I personally believe the Phoenicians would have won the war, and I'll give an example why. In the 8th century, in our timeline, Mexican tribes were able to conquer the central swath of the Yucatan Peninsula because they had atlatls, or spear throwers, and the Mayans were unable to deal with this technological shift. And meanwhile, the Phoenicians, with iron weapons and chariots and so forth, would have probably been able to conquer the Yucatan Peninsula as well. As history has shown us, the Mayan culture would live on. The Mayans still have a grassroots movement that wants to break off from the rest of the Central American nations, and an immensely vibrant culture. Also, in the early 1900s, There were large Mayan revolts to break off from the Mexican authorities, and this is all after 4 to 500 years of control by Spanish speakers. With all the trade between the Phoenicians and their client states, we can assume that horses and other European animals would have ended up in the Americas. With horses and other European animals, the tribes of the Great Plains in North America would have become horse nomads like the Mongols or the Huns in our timeline, and briefly in the 18th and 19th century in our timeline as well. The Americas having horses would mean that technology would advance faster because people would travel more. As people could travel further, supply lines would be longer, and communications would take shorter, so empires like the Incas could be much larger in this timeline. If you'd like to hear more about What If the Native Americans Had Horses alternate histories, I've made a What If the Native Americans Had Horses and Camels alternate history that delves into these subjects much more deeply. The link to it is in the description. Also, over time, European technologies like ironworking and the wheel would have spread across the Americas. As Old World technologies would have been spread to the New World in the time before the birth of Christ, that would mean that later on, there never would have been the massive steamrolling over the native cultures that there was after 1500 in our timeline. Meaning that the Native American cultures and nations would have survived to this day. With European technologies, I can assume that the tribes east of the Mississippi in the forest zone would have been like the forest tribes of Europe, like the Celts, Germans, and Slavs. The Punic Wars would have still happened in this timeline, and they would have had the same effect as in our timeline. Because the Atlantic is so large, and sailing techniques in the ancient world were so primitive that the Phoenicians in the New World would have been unable to help the Phoenicians in the Old World sufficiently for them to win the Punic Wars. An often arcane and forgotten part of history is that after the fall of Carthage, Hannibal fled east to the Greek kingdoms of the Middle East and to Greece to gather support for a war against Rome so that Carthage could rebuild itself and become independent again. This didn't work, but imagine in a timeline where there was a Phoenician empire in the New World. Hannibal would have fled to the New World instead of going east. Hannibal, because of his military genius, likely would have risen to the top of the Phoenician army in the Americas, and with his military brilliance, he likely would have been able to conquer the Mexican plateau. One of the cool parts of this timeline would be that there would be elephants in the Americas. The Phoenicians used elephants in warfare, meaning at least a few would have made it to the Americas and gone feral, meaning there would have been wild herds of elephants wandering the Americas in this timeline. A lot has gone on recently in this video, and so for you to keep track and not get confused at what the dimensions of the Phoenician Empire in the Americas are, this is a map that I briefly made so that you can find what the size of the Phoenician Empire in the Americas would likely have been. All empires fall at one point, and like all other empires in history, the Phoenician Empire in the Americas would have fallen too at one point. It likely would have been carved up by the forest, steppe, and desert tribes, similarly to the fall of Rome. The old Phoenician Empire would be split up between the desert, steppe, and forest tribes, each tribe taking its own kingdom, similarly to the fall of Rome. A mixture of cultures would take place, in which Phoenician culture, the cultures of the native peoples that had been there before the Phoenicians, and the North American cultures would all mix to create a new culture. Similarly to how French culture is a combination of Gallic culture, Roman culture, and Germanic culture. Each of these little kingdoms would view themselves as the successor to the older Phoenician Empire, and they would likely try to fight the other kingdoms for unity. This would create a technological arms race, as the different little kingdoms would try to get new weapons to defeat the other kingdoms and unite the empire, similarly to what happened in European history. The Phoenician Empire would have been viewed as the starter of an American civilization, similarly to how the Roman Empire was viewed in Europe for many hundreds of years, and for this reason, Punic would have remained the lingua franca amongst the different tribes that would all speak different languages in the successor kingdoms. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching.